Yeah, hi, this is Ashwin, and I'm going to be talking about a preferred process that I follow while explaining a cloud solutions architecture to a customer. So, without wasting time, let's get to that. Okay, let me start with explaining how this particular video is actually planned. So, when I reach each of the page, I'm going to first explain you my point of view and how I am going to explain and then get to the details. That way, it helps you to prepare yourself when you have to do the same thing. So yes, we're going to be talking about explaining the Azure design architecture to a customer. So here we're going to use a fictional company called ABC Corp. This is typically the first slide in any of your conversation where you put the name of the project and the company name. Maybe you can add the logo of the company and the consulting firm and your details. Maybe you can put your team details here. Now the next thing I need to do is set up a scenario here. That is, here I'm trying to tell them that I understood your current requirements and what is the reason that you are moving to Azure. So in this case, I'm mentioning ABC Corp as an on-prem instance running on VMware host and is preparing to migrate the infrastructure to Microsoft Azure. And in the initial pre-sales conversation, some of the reason that we understood are the current data center agreement is due for renewal. And we actually understand that the customer has understood the agility, scalability, cost effectiveness, global network, and the total cost of ownership of Azure as an advantage to move to Azure. Now, these reasons are something that you get to know when you do the proper pre-sales engagement. So this is an output that you can take from that. Now, in this slide, we are going to be talking about the things that we're going to discuss today. This is to ensure that the users are going to give the right amount of attention to the whole engagement. So the first thing is we talk about the enterprise governance and compliance. Then we talk about the attributes that you looked into for this architecture. Then we look at the constraints of the business and technical constraints. Then we show them the solution architecture that we have created. Then we talk about the solution components used. Then we talk about security, monitoring, operations, disaster recovery things, and the estimated cost of this whole build. Now coming to the enterprise governance and compliance, let me first explain you a few things for your advantage. That is, as we all know, a project without a target destination is actually nothing good. It's important to establish a rough vision of the end state before even taking the first step. Now, here I would like to give you a brief about the cloud adoption framework governance model because that's what I'm going to use for this activity. The cloud adoption framework governance model is something that identifies the key areas of importance during this project. Now, each area is something that is related to different types of risk in the company, and you need to address them as you adopt the cloud services. Now, if you look at broadly, this cloud adoption framework governance model contains corporate policy that's going to take care of the business risk, like you basically try to identify and understand the corporate risk. Then we talk about the policy and compliances. That's basically we convert the risk that we actually identified into a policy statement that is going to support by any compliance requirement as well. Then we talk about process. This is to ensure that and you have an adherence to the earlier stated process. Now, this particular cloud adoption framework is based on five disciplines. That's cost management, security baseline, resource consistency, identity baseline, and deployment acceleration. Now, because the governance requirement will change through the cloud adoption journey, a different approach to the governance is required. Now, the companies no longer need to wait for a small team because the business results are expected to be more quickly and smoothly. And that's the reason IT governance must also move quickly to keep pace with the business demand, to stay relevant around the cloud adoption, and it's also going to avoid any shadow IT situation. Now, the first thing that you can discuss is incremental governance. An incremental governance approach is going to empower these traits that we actually just discussed. The incremental governance is going to rely on a small set of corporate policy, process, and tools to establish a foundation for the adoption and the governance. And that foundation is basically called the minimum viable product, or MVP. Now, the governance is not exactly a replacement for any key functions. But that's very much necessary for the security, networking, identity, finance, or DevOps, or any of those functions to perform properly. The next thing that you can actually look at is the enterprise landing zone. Now, this is not the technical landing zone that we are talking about. This is basically the enterprise agreement that you're going to sign with the company. You basically know that the enterprise agreement can be divided into departments, accounts, subscription, resource groups, and things like that. More on that, read the Microsoft document on enterprise agreement portal. Now, when you look at the next option to put some sort of governance is management group. Now, what is a management group here? The management group is a container that's going to help you to manage assets. Basically, you can create policies. You can actually make sure that you have a compliance available for each of the subscription. Now, all the subscription in the management group is going to automatically inherit the conditions that are applied onto the management group. So it's actually easy for you to manage. And in any organization, it's always good when you design an infrastructure, always create two management group, one for production, another one for non-production. And this is going to help you manage the role-based access control, and you could have different policy enforcement, and that can be useful for compliance. Now, we need to ensure that there is a proper subscription design in place. What do you mean by that? You could actually have subscription for each workload, or you could have subscription for each of the environment. Like you can have one subscription for SharePoint Farm, another subscription for maybe some other third-party application that you're deploying on it, or you could have one subscription for every production system, one subscription for non-production system. Now, whatever name that you give to the subscription, you can always try to keep it in line with what it is actually trying to do. Yeah, so of course you can rename it later, but it's just good to actually make sure that the subscription has a name which relates to the workload that it's actually handling. And the next thing any company would be interested in knowing is how you're going to manage the identity. So in any organization, you could basically have an on-premise system, or you basically might get into a cloud-only solution. So if you have an on-premises, in this case, as this customer has, we're going to look at more like a hybrid situation, wherein you need to ensure that the identity is synced between the on-premises and the cloud. So you need to understand that we might have understood a lot of things when we do the assessment on this particular organization. You it could be possible that that organization has already enrolled into a cloud technologies like Office 365, which means he must be already using some sort of hybrid identity management. So it's important that you understand this in the assessment or in the pre-sales activities. The next thing any company would be interested to understand is, have you considered resource consistency? Now, what do you mean by resource consistency? It's basically going to make sure that you have certain policies that is related to the operational management of the environment or application, or it could be the workload. Now, you basically need to understand it is very important that you need to provide some sort of monitoring of this particular application or workload or the assets that you are actually deploying. And there could be also certain commonly executed tasks that is required to be created to meet the scale demands, or even you might want to remediate certain activities because it has violated certain operations. Now, within the 5 disciplines of the cloud governance, which we mentioned, resource consistency is a discipline that ensures that resources are consistently configured in such a way that they can be discoverable by IT operation and are included in any recovery solutions. So you could actually make sure that your design has some sort of usage of grouping of the asset, or maybe you can use some templates, or you could use policies. The next thing in your design should be about compliance enforcement. So there's 2 things that you can be helpful in this case, and that's going to be the Azure policy. Now, Azure policy is basically a service that you're going to use to create and assign and manage policies, or you could actually even create Azure blueprint. That's basically going to define a repeatable set of Azure resources, and a blueprint can basically handle role assignment, policy assignment, and it can handle Azure ARM templates, and it basically deals with resource group. So I'm just giving an example. I mean, you could actually have policies to enforce certain tag and to value. You could basically have a policy which is going to specifically restrict the resource creation on a particular location, or you could actually have certain audit created based on the VM configuration. The next thing that you need to ensure that is there in your design is naming standard. Now, a well-designed naming standard is going to enable you to identify the resources in a portal, or even in a billing, or within a script. Now, you likely already have some sort of naming standard for your on-premises organizations already. So you could actually try to make use of it, but always try to use more cloud consistent naming standard. Like, say, for example, if you're creating an Azure virtual network, you can name it with the prefix vnet dash. Or if you're creating a resource group, you can prefix it with rg dash and things like that. The next thing that you should consider in your design is resource tagging. Now, this is something that can be useful for resource management, automation, and in the accounting. Like, for example, you could have a tag in the application which says app, the name of the app, or what tier is it. So it'll be a tier, and I'll say web. And if it is a dev environment, I'll say env, and then I'll put the value as dev. If it's a department of IT, then I'll type department and then put IT to that. And I could even mention the owner and things like that. So you get the point. And the next option is to ensure that you have some sort of resource lock that is added in your design. Now, you need to understand, as the organization adds more core services to the subscription, it is becoming to a situation where it is increasingly important to avoid any business disruption. And one of the common disruption that occurs is a script or a tool or something that is executed on the Azure subscription and it unintentionally deletes a resource. So a resource lock is going to be useful. So I think I've explained to you what this slide is all about. And while talking to the customer, you should be telling him what you have done, what is your point of view towards incremental governance, what's your point of view on the enterprise landing zone, management group, subscription design that you have used, the identity solution that you have added, what are you doing to ensure the resources are consistent, what are you going to do to ensure the compliance is enforced, what's the naming standard that you're using, and what are the resource tagging mechanisms that you are into, and finally you can ensure them that the resources have resource locks added so that it cannot be deleted unintentionally. So let's now talk about the architectural attributes to it. The first thing foremost is security, because your architecture should be security first approach always used. Now when you talk about security, you generally need to focus on the information protection. So you can actually specify the things that you have used to ensure that the information protection is in place. The next thing is you can actually help update them that wherever possible you have used the native security controls, and you can inform them that you have always used the identity as the primary access control because that's the recommended way of doing it. And you need to ensure that you assume zero trust. So what is zero trust? So when evaluating any kind of access request, all the requested users, devices, and application should be considered untrusted until their integrity can be successfully validated. So this is an opportunity for you to explain how you have actually put that in your design. The next thing is the accountability, which means you should have a proper role-based access control on your design to designate a clear ownership of assets. The next thing is, as and where possible, your design should have automation added to the system. The next thing is availability. Now, this depends on the assessment. Now, based on your business requirements, you need to ensure that you need to tell them the availability solution that you have used in your design. Now, whenever possible, we need to ensure that the solution has some sort of resiliency features. What does that mean? It's going to allow the system to self-heal when a failure occurs by detecting a failure. Now, it could be basically responding to a failure gracefully, or it could be basically to ensure that there is some sort of logging or monitoring available for these failures and things like that. Now comes to the performance side. You need to ensure that the performance of the systems that you are actually going to provide meet or exceed the on-prem performance benchmark. Now, what's the on-prem performance benchmark is something that you should have already understood by now when you did the assessment of the customer. Now, coming to the scalability point of view, as and when possible, we need to ensure that these designs that we are actually creating is scalable. What do you mean by that is, whenever the load increases, the design that we have should be automatically adjusted to the load improvement requirements and take care of the steps it needs. The next is extensibility. Now, this is basically going to follow a design which is going to lead for continuous innovation in the whole thing. Now, you need to ensure that the Azure Virtual Data Center is not going to break something that they already have, and you're not going to add a lot of changes, which is going to have a lot of impact to their current operations. So it's important to keep in mind extensibility is something that you have taken into account, but it is something that is going to require a continuous innovation. Then we talk about the manageability point of view. That is, we can actually talk to them saying that in our design, we have actually used platform as a service as much as possible to reduce the manageability of the system. And the thing what we need to talk about next is the operability. So what you mean by that is the architecture should ensure that the hosted system gives the operations team the data and the insight that they need for a successful operational function. Now coming to the slide, when you are explaining this attribute to the customer, you need to ensure that you tell what you did to ensure that these attributes are taken care of in your architecture. Now coming to the point, a lot of input to this depends on your assessment that you did for the customer. But I think you get the point. This is the ingredients that is taken into account for a proper design. The next thing that we need to look at is when we did the assessment, we would have actually understood certain business constraints. And I'm just adding few here as an example, but that depends on how you did your assessment and based on your requirements. So I'm just giving an example is the customer had a requirement to ensure the encryption is in place at rest and at transit, and you need to ensure that the region at which these resources are created is hard-coded to a particular region. So basically that means whenever you create a resource, it's always created in that region. Now again, this is a constraint that is specific to this example. While you did the assessment, you would have understood that, and it will be a good idea to showcase that business constraint here so that they get to know that if there is anything that you have done in the design is basically because of these constraints. So here we're going to be talking about the technical constraints that you understood in the assessment. The first thing is you are informed by the governance team that they need to maintain the enterprise administrator role. This is just an example. It could be any of the other things too. And it was informed that although they maintain the enterprise administrator role, the governance team should not be able to access the Azure subscription. And you need to understand that the department administrators are owned by the IT team, and departments can create any number of subscription by consuming the assigned Azure credit. So this slide is going to help you update, hey, these are the technical constraints that we have added into the design, ensuring that your operations are taken care of. Now that you have established that you have understood the requirement of the customer, it's definitely the right time that you introduce the solution architecture that you have created. So it's typically a visual diagram that you have made. And in this case, I've just made an example visual diagram. And if you see on the right, it's actually the on-prem infrastructure that's running on VMware. And to whatever you see, the rest is the Azure. You do not have to spend a lot of time explaining this diagram here because you're going to have slides up front which is going to explain each component in detail. But you can actually tell very briefly that's on the right side, that's what your on-prem infrastructure looks like, and that's where you're going to have your VMware. And that's where you're going to install the configuration server, process server, the master target server, and you have the on-premise gateway that is talking to the VPN gateway of the Azure. And if you see that whole portion, that's a network and Security Hub. And you have lots of workloads that's mentioned below. That's the Active Directory domain service. There is another workload 1 and there is workload 2. You can probably mention the workload name, exactly what the customer needs are. I just mentioned it like that for the purpose of the demo. Now, if you see, there is a legend that I have used on the other side, which is going to give them a little bit more information on this particular diagram. So if somebody looks at the diagram, they can actually understand a lot of things. That is, that particular, the first thing that you see is actually a load balancer. And you have availability zones that you can see in the workload 1. You've actually grouped the systems accordingly and things like that. So I think you get the point. This is not a sample or something like a template. It's up to you. Based on your assessment, you will come up with your own Visio diagram. So now let's deep dive into certain components here. So if you look at the solution components that I use, the first thing that comes in your mind is the Azure subscription and resource group. Now, basically, we will create subscriptions for a customer in the name, like say customer name dash hub, or maybe you can actually keep customer name dash production, customer name dash staging, and things like that. Now, the resource group is basically a logical container that's going to hold all the related Azure resources. So you can actually explain him how the Azure subscription is created for you, how the resource groups are made for you. Like, you should probably tell the deployment strategies that you have used here. Like say, for example, all the Azure resources that is related to a workload is going to go to the same resource group. Like say, for example, you have a resource group for Active Directory and things like that. Now, we can actually even tell them based on your design, like each resource group is going to have its own VNet and things like that. It depends on your design. So you can actually combine your additional information here and talk to them. The next is the management group. It's basically going to give a level of scope for the subscription, and we can actually tell that how we have actually planned the subscription here. That is, we have 2 management groups. That's one for production, another one for non-production. Again, it depends on the customer requirements and how you have discussed with him in the assessment. The next thing is we can say the network and security hub. Now, let's keep it very clear. This particular design that we have actually created is actually more like a hub and a spoke infrastructure scenario. And there are other ways to deploy infrastructure as well. But this current design that you're looking at is a typical hub and spoke design. The hub is basically a network, virtual network basically, and that's in the Azure, and it's going to act as a central point for the connectivity for your all the on-premise network. And in the network and security hub, that's where you deploy your perimeter firewall, WAF, internal firewall, IPS, IDS, all the security solutions that you're going to put for your workload. You basically your Express Route gateway or a VPN gateway, your public IPs, and things like that. Or it could be your antivirus servers or any other backup solutions and things like that. And then you have the workload spoke. That's basically the workload network or the next VNet, which is going to have the workloads here. So it's going to be a good idea to explain the customer the hub and spoke model here, and that's where they are going to be very comfortable in actually this design. So I'm not going to go into the details of each of the solution components here. Basically, you can list out the solution components, and you can probably ask the customer if any of the component need more explanation. You can actually talk on that. And if you think a particular component is going to take more time, you can actually specify them that, hey, let's get into a separate meeting. And basically, it could be possible that it's only the technical guys required in those meetings. So I'm actually going to run through the the solution components that we have used in this case. We have Azure Key Vaults, then we have the Azure Log Analytics Workspace, Azure Monitor, Sentinel, Backup Service, DDoS Protection, the Firewall, Application Gateway, Azure Policy, then Azure Bastion, the management subnets and jump box that we have used, then the VNet peering, the network security groups, the user-defined routes, VPN gateway, the express route, the site-to-site VPN, shared services like all those shared services like the antivirus and things like that. Then Active Directory domain controllers, Azure storage accounts, or Azure storage soft deletion, Azure functions, Azure AD, Azure Security Center, Azure Disk Encryption, Azure SQL Managed Instance, Azure Load Balancer, Azure Traffic Manager, Azure VNet Service Endpoints, Azure Private Links, Azure Availability Zones, Azure Virtual Machine Scale Sets, Azure Update Management, and you can actually talk about the Azure Site Replication Service and Azure Migrate if you're doing a migration to Azure. Now, at this point, you should be asking question to the end users or whoever is joining on that meeting that do you want to explain any of these components in detail? And keep in mind, you tell them if it is going to take more than 2 to 5 minutes, you would require it as a separate meeting, because there could be possible that there are management resources in the same meeting and they're not exactly interested in knowing the details. But be prepared on all the components that you have used so that when they ask you questions, you should be able to answer them. The next is talking about security. So it's important that you tell them or explain them the security responsibility. That is, if you are actually using infrastructure as a service, you need to explain them that Microsoft is going to operate and secure the base infrastructure and the host operating system. You still need to make sure that the customer takes care of the control of the basically the data, identity, application, virtualized operating system, and any other infrastructure controls that you need to have. And when you say if you are using any platform as a service, then you can actually tell the difference in the responsibilities. Then we talk about the encryption that you have actually used. Like you can actually explain them about the differences in the encryption at rest, encryption at transit, or encryption in use scenarios. Then we talk about the network security recommendations, basically. So it's something that you can actually talk about a situation or a rule that you have applied in your design. Like say, for example, we're not going to assign or allow rules with a broad range. Let's say, for example, we're not going to have any rule which says 0.0.0, basically allow 0.0.0 through 255, 255, 255, basically any, right? So you're not really going to have any allow rules with a broad range. And always you have used CIDR to basically segment the networks, and you basically ensure to create a network access controls between the subnets and things like that. And you can actually talk about a lot of things here, like what have you done to adopt the zero trust approach, what is that you have done to ensure there is a controlled routing scenario here, or you can talk about the network virtual appliances that you have used. Let's say, for example, in your design, you have used some sort of Palo Alto network virtual appliance or anything like that. So it's something that you can actually talk right now. And then it's about how you're going to manage the perimeter network or the DMZ. Like you need to understand your on-premise network, or the engineers who are actually joining the meeting, they could be quite a lot used to the DMZ and the perimeter network and things like that. So it's always useful if you talk in the same language. And we can say that we have ensured that the SSH and RDP is disabled from the internet. We make sure that we have all the systems that we have used is optimized for uptime and performance. We have used key vaults, and we can talk about the remote access security and all kind of those things. The next thing is basically telling them what is that you have done to put the cloud native monitoring solution, and because if they have an on-prem situation here, what is that you have actually done to ensure your on-prem systems are also monitored using the same. Now, when you do the assessment, you would have already got to know that they have certain kind of monitoring system in place. So it's up to you whether you want to use that, or you might have already spoken with the customer to see, do you need a cloud-based hybrid monitoring? So this is going to be a good place where you can talk on those. And the next thing is, it's something that most customers are aware of, but it will be a good idea to tell them it's good to have separate operations for each of these functions. Like you should have a separate security operations, separate network operations, separate infrastructure operations, separate operations for development, test, and operations scenario. And you can explain them what have you done in terms of role-based access control, or differences in the subscription, or differences in the VNet and subnetting and things like that. How have you basically segregated this in your design? Then it's always important to ensure that you have taken into account of the disaster recovery situation. You could actually get your systems recovered to a different region inside the Azure. You could have some sort of VNet peering between the regions, and you could basically use an Azure traffic manager to divert the traffic. So if disaster recovery is not there in your design, it's still your responsibility to tell them this is what you could do if you want to enable disaster recovery on your design. So now you have explained them the solution design, the components involved. This is the right time that you can actually show the estimated cost. I'm not showing a cost here in this video because it depends on your components. So you could basically have a simple Excel file or a table which actually tells them, hey, this is the estimated cost, and they might even come back to you, or possibilities are there. These estimated costs are already discussed in a separate meeting, but it's a good idea to just give a heads up on that here. All right, thank you very much. So this would have given you an understanding on how you're going to explain a particular design to a customer. And this is exactly a series that I am running right now to empower you, to make sure that you have all the knowledge available, to make sure you are becoming a successful architect in Azure. So if you have any questions, please feel free to connect me on LinkedIn, or else you can put it as a comment on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube. All right, thank you and have a nice day.